Welcome back to my channel. This time we're gonna look at the bottom 5 casting lords in 9th Age. So previous week I released a video for the bottom 5 combat lords, and now we're gonna look at the magic users. So that doesn't necessarily mean that they can't do magic at all or that they're really bad at magic. It's just that they are not that competitive in the greater picture, I would say. So yeah, without further ado, let's just go for the first choice. This is gonna be my number 5 pick, the soothsayer of the beast herds. So basically, this is your only option in the beast herd army, other than the greater totems, to have any spells. And the greater totems, they are fine, but they're bound spells, so that means that usually if you only take bound spells, you can't really force your opponent to dispel any high casting rolls. And that is usually where magic kind of shines. You sometimes get these rolls that are high, and then your opponent really has to struggle to dispel them, and then you can draw out the dice of your opponent, and that you can't do with bound spells. So the soothsayer is your answer there. However, it's quite an expensive wizard for what he does. He starts out at 160 points. Normally, a wizard apprentice is around 120 points ish. So for some reason, he pays 40 points extra. Maybe it's the extra 2 resilience that he has. Otherwise, I wouldn't really know because blood offering is not really a role that you will use often. I mean, it does guarantee that you can stick around a bit easier with your soothsayer. However, I've never seen anyone use it. Maybe it's also because people forget that the model has to rule. um, yeah, and it's just, well, just an average caster basically, with no special rules helping him in casting. There is a special item, I believe, in Beast Herds that allows you to get +1 to cast or something if you're in a forest. That does help a bit, and it makes it a bit better. However, just the standard soothsayer, I would say, it's just not a good piece because it's quite overpriced. Because the resilience on your wizard doesn't really matter, especially if you go for shamanism, because then you get the attribute anyway, which makes that you can't really get hurt that badly in combat. And then from ranged attacks, you normally shouldn't get a lot of damage anyway. The mount options, you can put them on a raiding chariot. I think this is still, yeah, it's a funny choice. The raiding chariot itself doesn't really provide you with a lot of damage. It doesn't make it so that you want to charge out with your soothsayer suddenly. Because the only thing you're going to do is the d6 impact hits. I don't know how many crew are on the raiding chariot, but otherwise, well, you only have one strength 3 attacks on the wizard. So it's just generally not that impressive. Then for the number 4 pick in my list, it's going to be the Dryad Ancient of the Sylvan Elves. This is a choice that I've never seen used, so I assume that the Sylvan Elf community knows that this guy is just not good at all. And that might be the reason why it's never included in any list, basically. Yeah, it's also not that impressive, right? If you compare it against some other wizards that the Sylvan Elves have, then the Dryad Ancient doesn't really match that well with the army. Also, I would say, because it has a very low customizability and it requires you basically to play Dryads because, well, it goes in a Dryad unit. It has a base of 25 by 25 millimeters. I think maybe it's interesting if you play a forest only theme army. But the Dryad Ancient, he doesn't really help in any other way. I could imagine that he could have a special rule that helps the Sylvan spirits generally. That would be nice, that would be useful, but currently as it is, it's just a character it doesn't really help your Dryads because in addition to the output of the Dryads, I believe he only adds 1 attack, so that doesn't really help. And then it's a wizard apprentice at 145 points and a wizard adept at 220, which is a little bit more expensive than the well, more or less standard human wizard. Um, yeah, and generally also he has access to divination and druidism. Druidism you also have access to through your other mages. So divination is basically this special thing there, I believe, because I don't believe the elf shamans in Sylvan Elves can take divination. It doesn't help elves as much as some other armies, because especially Know Thy Enemy, it's a great spell in a lot of armies, but for elves you already have a high offensive and defensive, so likely you will already hit on 2+, and you will already be hit on a 4+, and generally Know Thy Enemy doesn't really change that much. Your agility is also quite high, so it's suddenly it goes from a really good spell to not being that impressive if you play with elves a lot. And then otherwise, if you go for the wizard adept, you can also start taking Fate's Judgment, um, and Scrying, and the other divination spell, which I currently forgot, to be honest. Yeah, I think it's just a mediocre character. And then we continue with the number 3. This is going to be for me the Goblin Witch Doctor. This might be a bit controversial because you still see them on Goblin Wolf Chariots. Yeah, on the Goblin Wolf Chariot, I understand that you run them with Pyromancy, because it's nice to just have a fireball in some place where you just have your chariots and then you just put this guy in. It's not too much more expensive. I believe they start out at 120 and then the wolf chariot is 35. So for 150 points more or less, you get a Goblin Witch Doctor on a wolf chariot. And you just usually I see them being run in a unit of chariots, so with 2 extra chariots. And then it's basically 60 points more expensive than just a general chariot, just for a fireball. It's it's not that bad. But all the other varieties I basically never see, and I am quite disappointed actually that you never see the Cave Goblin Witch Doctor. However, I can imagine that that's because goblins are not that much played, to be honest. Just common goblins or cave goblins or forest goblins. And I think that the double power shroom is quite funny because you can force through a spell a little bit more. Obviously, it is not that reliable, but yeah, I think it's a funny rule on a wizard. Yeah, and otherwise, yeah, just taking a goblin witch doctor doesn't really have any value over taking an orc shaman that you can make your general, because that is something that you very often see. The forest goblin witch doctor, you can take the gargantula and then you get an extra spell, I believe, and a 4-up Aegis against ranged attacks on the gargantula. It's quite decent, however. I can imagine that you'd rather just have a Goblin King with a great weapon on the Gargantula, because the Gargantula anyways has 8 hit points. So yeah, it's just not that interesting, I think. Then for the number 2, we continue with the Vassal Conjurer from the Infernal Dwarves book. It's not the only caster in the game, in the book, I mean. So for Infernal Dwarves, you either have the Dwarven Mage, basically, or you have the Lamassu Scholar, which is kind of like a Toruk, but then a mage also. And then this guy is just walking around in the army book like, what am I doing here? It's quite a cheap mage. I think it's one of the cheapest in the game, if I'm not mistaken. However, it also comes with some downsides. So it is insignificant, it's not a leader, it's unbranded, and it has Wizard Apprentice, so it cannot take any special items from the army book, it cannot cast the hereditary spell, and it cannot join units with more than half of their models with Infernal Brand or units of Shackled Slave. So basically it can only join vassal levies, if I'm correct. Yeah, it's just not impressive. So I like how they only give the vassal steed upgrade to wizard adepts, because that means that you cannot make a chaff piece out of it, because for 135 points that would still be quite okay. If you just have a pyromancy slinging chaff piece, that could be nice. It seems to me that it's only useful for the access to witchcraft and for theme armies, where you play a couple of these guys, and then that is your magic phase. Um, Witchcraft can be always useful. It's usually, to me, it feels like a lore that helps you decrease the range damage that the opponent can do on you. There's also players that really use it to spam Raven's Wing and then try to get some movement spell through. But I believe that you need some other movement spell like Vanilla Stance from Evocation in order to really make it work. I don't actually know if Infernal Dwarfs has access to Evocation. I don't believe so. So then that is basically out. And I also don't think that Infernal Dwarfs is that vulnerable to range damage. So Witchcraft might not even be the best lore for the Dwarves there. However, if you play a lot of the vassal levies, then Witchcraft becomes more interesting with the wheel turns. Yeah, and yeah. Otherwise, it's just not that special. So we'll just leave it at that, and then we'll go to the next choice. This is going to be the number one choice. It's going to be quite a controversial pick, I believe, because it's going to be the Vampire Count of the Vampire Covenant. This is not because he's a bad caster, because, well, he can be quite a good caster if you go for Nosferatu and you go for a Wizard Master and you take Blood Magic, and then you're gonna basically be one of the best casters in the game. However, the Vampire Count starts at 340 points, and I think that is the main issue there. You have so much customization that you can do with this guy, but he always ends up way too expensive for what you get, basically. So you do have 5 attacks at offensive 7 at strength 5, which is a good profile, a really good profile, to be honest. Because with any weapon you give him, he just works. I mean, paired weapons get you 6 attacks at offensive 8 with ignore parry with strength 5, which is suddenly an infantry blender for 10 points, basically. With a halberd, you go to 5 attacks at strength 6, which is just great. A great weapon gives you strength 7, which is also quite nice from time to time. And a lance, well, also allows you to pair it up with a shield, and then, well, you can get to quite a decent armor save quite quickly. It's a good character, but 340 points, come on. And he starts out as a wizard apprentice, so if you want to make a wizard master out of him, you are already at the 565 price point. That goes really quickly. I think it's because vampire counts are basically essential in the Vampire Covenant army book. They also provide you with some much needed killing power in the army, because the rest of the army is mostly tooled towards grinding, except for the Swift Death category. So you do need your vampires also to do some work, and then that combined with the algorithms that Ninth Age uses for price point determinations, it's still a choice that is being picked by a lot of players, which makes a lot of sense, because you do need these attacks from your vampire, unless you go Nosferatu, and then you don't really want your vampire to come in combat, but that is being mitigated by the fact that your vampire is just really good at casting. Yeah, so it can be a good caster, it can be a good combat piece, it can be a good general, but it is so freakishly expensive. It's it's just really expensive. I also, every time I build a Vampire Covenant army list, I still include vampire counts. I would like not to include any. However, it's tough. You start to get out your vampires. They are there to provide magic also. You can fill the gap with necromancers, but then Vampire Covenants also rely quite heavily on the magic, so if you just play Necromancers, then it always feels a little bit mediocre because you can't really get the magic in the place where you want it, and you can't really support your vampires anymore. So you end up basically taking vampires, and then you want to kit them out, and then if you only kit them out for combat, then you don't really kit them out for magic anymore, so then you run into the same problem. So then the limitation of points of special equipment for the Vampire Court Chase, that is mostly what you run up against with the Court Chase, because they only are resilience 4, so usually you have to kit them out also a little bit for combat, so then you can't spend any points on magic equipment to boost the magic. So then you end up with a vampire count, and that one is 340 points without anything on it. So by the end, at the moment where you're tooling up your vampire count and you finish tooling him up, he's often 700, 800, 900 points, and he often doesn't really bring 900 points to the table, to be honest. That means that if you kill the vampire count of the enemy, then usually you just manage to win the battle. And they are tough to take down. However, usually they still only have 3 hit points in the end. They still only, for a 900 point piece, have resilience 5, and usually they do have like a 2-up armor save. But in a duel against some other characters, they can still lose. And the trouble is also that you can't really run them on their own, because just the unlucky bolt thrower shot is just gonna kill your unit, your vampire count. And then if you put him in a unit, then the enemy can just focus on the unit and crumble him down. It's a very fine line to walk with the vampire count. But that doesn't mean that there aren't some great builds with the vampire counts. I think it's a complex character. It can be a very good character, but it is also my number 1 pick for the worst character and worst casting character in the game. So with that, we went through the entire list of casting characters in 9th Age. Probably you won't agree with me, especially with the vampire count on the number 1 spot. Do you have any other suggestions, anything I missed? Then please let me know in the comments below. See you next time.